Well, let's go ahead and get this party started. Hi, everybody. I'm Jocelyn Goldfine, and I'm your host. Delighted to welcome you back to Zetta Bytes Live. I'm one of the partners here at Zetta. We are the first institutional check writer into AI-first startups who are solving business problems, and we believe that technology powered by data will reshape business as we know it. Zetta Bytes Live is a program organized around telling those stories, and so we will be every month or two, we'll feature deep dives into the state of the art in AI platforms, and we'll showcase successful applications of AI with industry leaders like today's guest. So Pegah, thank you so much for joining us. Pegah Ebrahimi is an accomplished technology leader and entrepreneur. She was a C-level leader at both Cisco and Morgan Stanley, and she's driven global expansion, led multi-billion-dollar businesses through key digital transformation, and built and bought numerous AI ML products. As a serial entrepreneur and an MIT alum, Pegah is also a prolific angel investor, advisor, and board director. And as an expert in global technology strategy, she brings passion and expertise to the topic of how enterprises can best adopt AI and ML. Pegah, welcome to the show. Thanks so much for joining us.
Thank you for having me. This is going to be fun.
Yes, I think so. I want to start by sort of rewinding the clock a little bit, because, I think right now machine learning and AI, they might be peak hype. I don't know anybody working in enterprise IT or any founder who wouldn't, be more than familiar with machine learning. But do you remember when you were first exposed to it, like when and how it came up and got on your radar, and when did you kind of know it was going to be a difference maker?
Well, I would tell you the first time was probably in my probability and stat class at MIT, where, back then it was not necessarily always referred to as AI ML. It was much more data analytics, deep data analytics to get predictions. And I was at the same time, I will not confirm or deny, but I was part of a poker and blackjack kind of club at MIT. And I was like, trying to count cards and trying to do all this stuff when you're, you're at MIT, just honing some of those skills and thinking, oh, if there was a machine doing this stuff, it could do it so much better than myself in my head. So some of it was then for how do I use it for, more like betting and things like that, and just thinking about it from that perspective. But look, my first job out of MIT was in finance. And I would say there was, in as many ways, finance was really ahead of the curve in some of the data that they were capturing and trying to, whether it was trying to predict fraud behavior, things like that. So it was very, it was used in active everyday business, but only certain components, and really saw the value of how you could actually make the people better, not just predicting the typical fraud and those pieces, but how could you actually superpower the individuals? And so much of the billions of dollars of revenue that were generated were because of what was in everyone's head, and everyone knew they could do it better if they had more access to have things bubbled up to them when they needed it. And so that was when I really started thinking about how it could impact the business.
Yeah, a lot of people don't know that banks, financial services were among the earliest adopters of machine learning and AI. I think, much more below the radar than the Netflix movie recommendation challenge, which is where a lot of people first encountered it.
Yeah.
So thinking about enterprise uses of AI rather than consumer, what are some characteristics of good projects for AI within an enterprise? What makes something a good target?
Yeah, I would say, look, early on, I was always had this entrepreneurial mindset, even though I was at large companies, of thinking how you can prove out certain things work. And I think the one thing in large companies that sometimes they do poorly is you're waiting to have, this holy grail, or trying to have it do too much. And when AI came on the more mainstream radar for enterprises to say, how can we be using it? We're capturing all this data. Why aren't we doing more with it? And it was, yeah, of course it can do so much, but they didn't tackle some of the kind of easy to grasp stuff. And so I would say really great, even in organizations now, going after pieces which the business unit can really think about how it's driving the business. And so obviously there's a bunch on, the cost structure wise where people start in a supply chain, but how could it be optimizing our and PS, how can it be tied to specific outcomes is what I would say are really great uses of AI now. And then in the other thing, just because data integrity is an issue in large organizations, anyone who worked at a large organization know you ask for 2 data sets and they come out different, and you're like, I asked for the same data but 2 different days and the data is different. So there is always going to be some of that. So it's also going after use cases that don't need the crazy high fidelity, where you're not going to, you know, as an example, predict cancer, and then that's what it's all dependent on. And also dealing with the user who really wants the high fidelity, so that you need to get the models to be at 97% accuracy or more, or else, you know, if 1 out of 10 things is wrong, people are like, okay, I don't trust this anymore, I'm not using it. So picking examples where you have ways to kind of walk and it's incremental value, but even if you're at 85%, 90%, people feel like you got a lot.
I mean,
right?
90% sounds like a decent grade on a test, but it, you know, I think in day-to-day life, being wrong 1 in 10 times is a pretty unreliable system. Can you give some examples where, you know, 90% accurate is okay?
Yeah, so for example, what I, even at Cisco, when I was building out some of the propensity to buy modeling, look, there's so many SKUs, so many things happening. It's people, if you're taking a sales force and you're saying, we'll bubble up things that we think are really great opportunities, you say yes or no. If 9 out of 10 times you bubble up good stuff to me, sales people will love that, because they're and make it easy also for me to say yes, no. And when I add it to an opportunity in Salesforce, it actually is using that to become better over time, because now it knows, hey, whenever people add a recommendation, this is the likelihood it actually turns into the next stage. This is the likelihood it actually drives an outcome. So I think it's those cases, and also those types of cases where 9 is actually great. Bubble up 9 opportunities to me, sure. If 1 or 2 of them are even wrong, I'm still happy that you did that. And the same I would say for, look, when I was at Morgan Stanley, next best actions in the wealth side of the business was really taking off. And it's, if you're a financial advisor and you're getting opportunities of, here's good things you can be doing based on the behavior of your clients and based on certain things, if you're bubbling up 9 things, it's a home run. 9 things I wasn't thinking about doing, or maybe I was thinking about doing 6 of those things. These 3 things sound great and they're timely. That's the other thing I would say where 9 out of 10 becomes great, is if you're giving me insights in a timely way, versus even if it's not accurate, if it's more real time and I can do something with it and choose
Fabulous. No, those are fabulous examples. I think that probably gives everybody a really good picture. So what other advice besides project selection, if you had to give advice to your former colleagues or to sort of folks working in business units at big enterprises like Cisco and Morgan Stanley, what advice would you give them to get going with AI?
Yeah. Well, I think there's, look, if you talk to, I can frame it in 2 ways. One is the folks in large organization, and one is if you're a small company that's selling to those large organizations. I do see a big trend that's happening where the promise of AI was, oh my God, it can do so much for the business. So let's centralize everything. Let's figure out how to maximize all the value we can drive. And what and because data management was becoming a bigger deal over time, and so it made sense to, as your data was getting centralized, also bringing some of those capabilities. What I'm seeing now is much more of the decentralized starting to work. And in some areas you want centralized, right? Like if you're doing massive supply chain and all those things, you want that. But I do think there's a lot of business units and individuals that see, hey, I know the data we're capturing can actually drive these 2 incremental benefits, but those incremental benefits might not be as meaningful for the large org, but they're meaningful for me and my business. And how can I implement data science? That's why you're seeing, you know, Datadog doing DataRobot getting so much traction. That's why you're seeing much more people wanting to have the ability to tack on certain things and get going much faster, versus historically you were depending on more the centralized team in the company doing things. And then the other thing I would say is to that theme is, what's happening is large organizations have invested a bunch of money in that space, and they're not really sure what value specifically they're driving. And so because of the decentralized nature, there's a slight disconnect on what's the specific outcomes that are happening as a result of it. So it makes it, as the data gets more robust and more loads are happening, the cost is going up, and they're having a hard time, proving out why it makes sense to still keep doing this. And so that's the other reason where I do think there's going to be more pressure on the decentralized cost structure if you're someone that's selling to those pieces versus if you focused on the decentralized.
That's really interesting, because of course, we've been talking about enterprises sort of, homegrown use of AI. Obviously, they're buying tools and platforms, systems like DataRobot to get going with models. But of course, the other thing that happens and that certainly is enabled by this kind of decentralization is just sort of straight up buying AI powered solutions from a startup, where it might be a smart CRM, or it might be, supply chain management system. Now supply chain's on my brain, but something that feeds off the enterprise's data, right? So exactly. it is still kind of deeply integrated. And so how should companies think about those build versus buy decisions, not just in tech, but how does AI ML change the build versus buy calculus, and sort of what are the advantages and disadvantages to homegrown versus working with the big tech vendors or even with startups?
And again, this has two perspectives, because I do advise for a lot of early stage startups. It's more taking these things into account, right? So right now, and this might be, if I have a lot of execs in large companies here, I'm sorry, but I was an exec in a large company, so I can say this about myself. What the tenure in organizations, if you're in large organizations, historically, it used to be pretty high. I would say execs right now, the speed of technology moving, and there's just much more focus on quarters and years, and even so the execs really care about showing traction and showing velocity. So that's why I also think it's a good time to want to be selling very outcome driven, purposeful, solutions to large companies for that reason, because it's the buy, you can build it, but people have been burnt. It takes a lot of time. And now as an exec, you've staked this big effort on it, and you might not see the value. And so because of that, I think execs are much more tied to show me an outcome I can get to, and how can I get there faster. And given the demand for AI ML talent, given all this stuff, it's harder to achieve it in a very short amount of time and gets value out of it quickly, unless you sometimes supplement. So I still think the value driver for the large organization is the data they have, and it's the business people they have that are deciding what matters are going to really drive the business. It's not really in the middle piece of help me do that part. That's not their expertise. It's more the two ends of it. They have the data that is really valuable, and then they have the business owners that know, for the strategy of the business and where they want to go and all that stuff, what things do I need to drive to? And so that's their more value add. So I think companies are starting to focus on those two pieces and figure out who can make the jump from here to and aligning those two pieces together. So I would say if you're a startup, like focus on feeding that gap.
If I can grossly simplify, I think for a lot of startup founders that I work with, they really believe that their value add is that they've got some unique, special product insight, that some product functionality that only they can think of, or only they can build. And enterprises should buy from them because it solves a problem that can't otherwise be solved. But it sounds like what you're saying is enterprises don't necessarily believe they can't build it. The stronger appeal is that the startup gives you speed, gives you velocity to the outcome.
Yeah.
And that actually the enterprise may feel, and may be correct, that without the ingredients that the enterprise has, the data and the subject matter expertise, the startup may not even be successful.
Yeah. And that's why I think the startups that tend to focus on a specific, space tend to do much better. So if you're a company like Gong or others where you're focusing on, okay, the salesperson, how can I how can I use the data the company has and we have and aggregate and all that stuff, make that better. They can get to results much faster, right? Because they're singularly focused on one outcome. Whereas in sometimes large organizations, you have a bunch of outcomes you're focused on.
Yes. Yes. Now we're turning to the topic of, startups working with enterprises, and one of the things that really enables that is that the enterprise, frankly, there's a little bit of a value exchange that's not there in traditional software or SaaS, which is the enterprise has to share their data to the startup to power the model to create the value for the enterprise. And that's, one of the things that makes that tricky is the need for enterprises to be compliant with their data and to have good sort of governance and oversight about how their data is being used. And, as you think of the state of the art today, from sitting inside huge tech vendors like Cisco, but also, huge heavily regulated enterprise like Morgan Stanley, what's your opinion about the degree of regulation and data today? Do you think there's too much? Is it impeding progress? Is it just right, too little?
It's interesting. I think in some areas where consumers are very focused, there's a lot of scrutiny, right? Like you're thinking about, okay, what's my iPhone? What's the data that the phone is capturing? What's the data on my app usage? All that stuff. I think, interesting enough, they tend to, even though there's more scrutiny, they tend to push the boundaries more. Whereas if you're at large companies and incrementally AI/ML is going to help you do things better, more efficiently, slightly, but your existing currently is not do or die based on the AI, right? Like if you're a Netflix, if you don't do that, you're like toast, right? If you're just recommending stuff that I don't want, you're not going to have enough subscribers, all that stuff. Whereas if you're like, let's say Morgan Stanley, it's not like you're going to lose your customers tomorrow. So the risk appetite of wanting to actually do things with the data are, I would say, almost hindering it, because they don't want to do it unless there's more clear guidelines on what they can do with it. So I would say more established industries, there's more of a resistance, whereas if you're if you're in a new category and things like that, people push the boundaries more. So I would say it's a little bit of both, and unfortunately, it kind of almost feeds this narrative of the larger companies not wanting to push ahead as much in those areas.
So let me make sure I've got this right. Are you saying that if there were more regulation, that enterprises, that sort of traditional enterprises would be more prone to adopt, that regulation would spur adoption, and that lack of regulations impeding?
I don't know about more, but clear. I think we're in this kind of no man's land a little bit of not being clear. So people are, so it's not necessarily more, but it's more transparent, clear. Hey, this is what we're okay with or not okay with, and things like that. And so people, I don't think they want to stand on any mine lands. But then internally, I would say that's why a lot of large enterprise use cases tend to be more about how can I run my own company more efficiently? How can I run my sales force more efficiently? How can I run versus how can I make the users, get certain pieces like that. But
No, that's I think that's actually like a really fair, if I think about the adoption curve of machine learning in consumer, where I think it's all been very end user facing, product forward AI versus in enterprise. I think that's exactly right. I think that's exactly sort of the track we're on.
Yeah.
And it will be a while, but it's coming that we see sort of AI powered product offerings from B2B facing enterprises. But
exactly.
So let's look at the telescope, and because these days you've left the big companies behind you, you're mostly angel investing, you're advising startups. What made you switch?
So look, I've been an operator for many years, and I one of the things I love doing is, even as an operator when I was CIO, is trying to see 3-4 steps ahead, not the 2 steps ahead. And look, I'm not right, but just trying. In the discovery of trying, you can see a lot of other avenues that might not come out, but you get to learn a lot. And so for me, when I'm operating, given especially the businesses I've had and the amount of kind of transformation or efforts that had to go on, you get very blinders on and you're on execution mode. And so this, taking this time, it was really purposeful in wanting me to run a series of experiments, both with companies, with different spaces, and really having this ability to do more like a 180 with turning my head, almost making a 270, right? Of looking around a lot more and being able to see themes that it was hard to do when you're just executing and running a business, right? So, and then I love founders.
Yeah. I'm teaching my 16-year-old to drive right now, and so that analogy about peripheral vision really resonated with me, because it's literally a blind spot check. You're checking your blind spot when you turn your head like that.
Yeah, and it's really hard to like look in the horizon and the distance if you're constantly focused on the trees right in front of you. So so that and I just look, I would say at MIT I started a startup. I was more entrepreneurial then, but a little bit risk averse. So that's why I ended up in a hybrid situation doing technology banking. But there's a part of me that I really love founders, and I love the way they can drive so many industries and so many of these. So it's also given me this time to really focus on that and figure out how I can really be helpful, especially as companies are getting in this flywheel. Because one of the big benefits that I was lucky enough to have is I was a buyer of software. I was a builder when I was CIO and a buyer. And then I was advising companies on more strategic situations. And then at Cisco, I was more selling software. And so I've really seen it from all three different angles. So I find that I can have a ton of impact right now. And this is the year of, COVID has made a lot of us want to focus our powers and our impact on things we're excited about. And so that's what I'm doing, running off the treadmill for a little bit to go for a light jog instead of on 10 speed.
I think it's outstanding. I think that's terrific. And so for the startup founders in the audience, what advice would you give a startup that wants to sell to enterprises? It's probably a lot of the startups that you work with. What is kind of the Pegah playbook?
Yeah, I think for selling to enterprise, I think psychology is way more important in selling than everyone thinks. And so I think who you're selling to and what matters to them and what part of the business. So you might be selling something that could be great for the business, but that's not what that leader matters to the leader right then, right? So what I would say is think about that more and hone a little bit of whether it's your product strategy or your selling strategy, really around that and what's going to motivate them to make decisions. Because one of the hard things for startups, the earlier you are, is you don't have that much resources, and you're spending these resources, especially when you're trying to sell to large enterprise, across these month-long processes. You don't have real clarity if it's going to go, not go, all those things. And so really being using that time efficiently and focusing on the type of customers that actually would benefit, or switching your story a little bit to make sure it resonates with them. And then I would say both for execs and for selling, I think there's going to be a much more massive shift, and you can see it. Look, even in engineering orgs with OKRs and with KPIs and everything, even in software buying or solutions, that's going to become more important, because you're going to your board, you're going to your CEO, you're going to say, here's the reasons we're doing X, here's the outcomes we're driving. Everything's just becoming much more driven in that way, versus before it was a little bit, I would say, if you have the luxury of time, you can't live quarter by quarter and focus that way. And so there's definitely much more focus on outcomes. So I would say if you're selling solutions, and if you're going to be a broad platform, it's know that and figure out how you're going to actually drive that. And then if you're going to be really solutions oriented, figure out how to tie the outcomes of the product to what that business leader or that person that's the buyer really cares about. Because if they're going to be, and this is the psychology part, if you're selling to me and I'm going to be using the outputs of what I'm doing to you to tote how well I'm doing in my business, or to say, here's the improvements I've done, or here, like, I'm not going to want to get rid of you. I'm definitely, like, if you're helping me look good, and this is the part I say is sometimes bad, but if you're helping me tell the story well and helping me look good, that's going to drive me wanting to have solutions. And that's why the speed part becomes important. That's why the outcomes, tie it to certain outcomes. And I would say, I think a lot of companies can become, knowing that theme, they can become much more creative on pricing as well. Because if you learn to tie things to certain outcomes, you can extract way more revenues on the upside when people get the outcomes they want, because I don't mind quote unquote overpaying if I got a huge benefit out of it. But what there is a resistance to in organizations now, given whenever SaaS, started taking off and there's 50 solutions that kind of do almost the same thing and all that stuff, it's like, you're like, I'm not going to spend all this effort, get resources devoted to it, and now not really have the payout. So then people get more resistant about even paying for pilots, paying for pieces, right? And so I would say, if you're a young organization, really think about, if you do really solve a pain point, figure out how to tie those outcomes to even your pricing and getting penetrated in and extracting even more value on the upside.
Can you think of an example where a startup really nailed this motion? Any startup you want to shout out for it, or even if you just want to, protect the names of the innocent? And
if then the ones I don't shout out, it's going to early stage, or look, there is definitely older company. I'm seeing it as a theme happening. Look, it started actually more so in the almost professional services world, where you'd say, oh, I'll get incentivized. I'm starting to see it in software that is driving, cost benefits, seeing it in AI software. So if you're actually a software that is making it faster for me to do things, or I can get better NPS and things like that, then people are paying for it. But I think it's my
but the attribution matters.
Down.
I can't just make your customers happier. I have to be able to measure that or attribute it to the model.
Yeah. And I would say that's the other thing for selling for enterprises. Look, there was the first, if you're in the business of trying to sell to reduce costs or to bring efficiency from an AI perspective, it's different than if you're in the business of driving better customer satisfaction and, revenues and things like that. You're almost having two different access points to the type of revenues you can get a hold of. But I've seen it work well in both. But it's also a prediction of where I think I'm talking. What I was more mentioning is I'm seeing the appetite a lot from the business buyers wanting it that way.
Yeah.
So.
Makes sense.
Yeah.
I have to think that a lot of the founders in the audience are sitting here thinking, I wonder how I get Pegah to advise me. So for their benefit, when you meet startups, what are you looking for before you commit time or money?
Oh, look, for me, I don't know if I've ever. I'm a middle child. I'm an immigrant child. And for better or for worse, I'm like always trying to overachieve. I'm trying to work on it. But because of that, I pick companies where I feel like, whether it's my know-how, my network, my skills, I can have a much more differentiated impact than somebody else. So I'm really very impact driven, right? So if I think, okay, I can really turn the dial and the company's going to be fine as is, and it's not going to move the dial for them, like it's less interesting for me, even though I'd be cheering them and introing them to whoever makes sense. But for me, it's much more about how am I seeing something ahead of the line that these guys are coming across that they're not realizing, or the opportunity. So sometimes I think for founders, you get used to certain motions and you also get these blinders on. And even though you're obsessive about your sector, you actually forget that, okay, what about channels? Can we be partnering with someone that actually can, instead of me trying to develop this crazy go-to-market motion, should we doing that? Should we? And you're just in the execution mode. So it's hard for you to ask for things. And so, and I also look for founders who really embrace wanting to get my hands dirty in things. I don't do high level. I feel like should be free. It should just be pass it forward. But it's more about getting, if they like someone that gets in the weeds with them and really tries to figure certain pieces out.
Fantastic, fantastic. All right, well, I think our audience is probably going to have tons more questions. So to sort of kick that off, we've got a special feature of our Zettabytes Live is we give a few members of the audience a chance to ask you a question live.
Oh,
so
fun.
let us go ahead and bring up Nick Spearin, and it looks like Nick is with a startup.
Hi, Nick.
And I think Nick
might need a set. Oh, there he is. Great.
Hey.
Hi, Nick.
Nick,
Hey,
welcome. Give us two
very,
sentences about your company and before you dive into the question, please.
Yeah, thanks for very insightful Fireside chat so far, and thanks for making this selection. My name is Nick Spearin. I'm the co-founder and CEO of Metapixel AI. We do AI-powered visual content production and post-production for e-commerce. So essentially, we take raw product photos from a photo studio and turn them into pixel-perfect images that meet all e-commerce standards, such as like putting products on white background, color correction, cropping, resizing, and all that stuff using AI. And we are on a mission to automate routine work with AI to enable, more creativity of humans.
Yes.
At the same time, with that mission in mind, with that value proposition in mind, sometimes in our sales conversations, we face the situations when, line workers, in this case, retouchers, and their managers, they are resistant to change. They don't want to lose their jobs. They don't want to risk their budgets, their headcounts in the retouching department due to automation. And the question is, what tactics did you develop during your career to address that resistance? And how would you recommend to sell more effectively to the enterprises in that situation?
Yeah, and let me answer it two ways, because there's one that's specific more to the product you have, and then there's more generally. I would say, let me start with your specific product. So when I was CIO for Morgan Stanley, we had outsourced. You have analysts, you have all this stuff, and we were outsourcing components of it, right? Like there was the whole wave of outsourcing, and that was, oh no, it's going to take our jobs away, things like that. And then there was, how could you incrementally make those better? So I would say two parts. It depends a little bit if you're talking to the folks that really don't want their positions removed versus the people who care about that budget, right? So that's more specific to you. So see, it might be that you need to sell that story more to someone that is actually saying, okay, why are we spending so much more on retouching when we could do that? So it's more, sometimes you have to up level one to get that buy-in. And then more generally, what I would say is back to my outcome. Look, in contact center, we used a ton of AI. In Morgan Stanley, like I said, next best actions, or even taking components of repetitive actions. And internally, the big thing should be less about, hey, we're reducing cost, which was the fear initially of AI, and it's more, how can we up level everyone? So instead of, if a call agent gets a call, they don't want to have to go look up while you're asking a question, go look up what they should be saying, hey, guessing how to answer the question or optimizing certain things based on your tone, that you're really frustrated already, or that they don't know you've been waiting on hold for so long. So how can I use that information to, and it's, how can you superpower people? And the same, and more about that, so that they can focus on the stuff that's actually more interesting. So even on a design, maybe it's not about, yes, in the long term, maybe it's reduced, but in some ways you can actually give them time to really focus on the design part versus the clearing out the background part. Let's think about the parts that matter. And then I would say the other part is really focusing around not replacement, but really about, and it depends on where the user is, right? So let's say if you're a user or a software buyer that cares about customers. So tie it more to the customers. And that's back to the thing. If you use this, the reaction time or the time to service a customer or the time for satisfied customers goes up, and try to capture metrics that actually is not a threatening metric versus, hey, we reduced the amount of employees you have. which them reducing the amount of employees really works with certain people. Like, that's why I said you might have to up level. So when I was CIO, I mean, that sounds bad, but I was thinking, okay, how can I reduce this cost that doesn't seem like differentiated? Because people are all for reducing undifferentiated resources so that they could move that money into differentiated resources. Does that answer some of it?
Yeah, absolutely. We have been thinking along those lines, but definitely that's a good angle on the problem.
Yeah, thank you so very much, and really appreciate you sharing that question. I think probably relevant to lots of founders. Let's go ahead and get Parinaz up for our second question asker. And Parinaz, you may need to start your video and unmute yourself as you come up.
I haven't looked at the chat. Am I supposed to look at the chat?
Nope, you're good.
I think we're ramping up. We just,
there she is.
I think we just need audio and video over on the guest side.
Hi, welcome. I think we have another founder with us. Can you tell us a little bit about your company before diving into your question? Parinaz, you are live.
Hi, can you hear me?
Yes.
Hi, my name is Parinaz Vahobzadeh. I'm the CEO and co-founder of Blue Boat Data. We're an enterprise analytics software company. Great discussion so far. Pegah, we would love to hear your thoughts, if you could share your thoughts on where you see companies on the curve of making data-driven decisions, where you see that has changed in the last couple of years versus where you see it going perhaps in the next year or two, and specifically moving from or living with AI analytics in parallel to the basic reporting that enterprises are used to.
Yeah. Not enough, I would say, not enough happening yet. And I do think there is going to be a wave of it, but it's just taking longer because people focus sometimes on the critical business pieces externally, and then it kind of comes in the next way. So I think the two areas where it has done the most is sales and supply chain. So supply chain and really cost reduction and optimization, and then sales in, you've seen it, like even software companies like Outreach and Gong and all these. And the reason I would say is, back again to the example, you can be 90% accurate and it's still good. It's still insightful. It's still driving you to have behavior on the sales side. When I talk to business leaders, both in the technology side or just business owners, there's this, you're relying on a lot more rudimentary data analysis to make decisions. And part of it is it's still much more complex to get back to the whole centralization, decentralization, more complex to get some insights. So as an example, look, if you look at billion-dollar businesses, revenue businesses, still the forecasting, sales forecasting, mainly is pretty rudimentary. If you think of the data that's there, the history that's there, and you're still kind of relying, and companies actually really do, a CFO really does have to think about that, a business GM really does have to think about that, and half the time you're doing these back of the envelope calculations to see if you're going to make it and all that, those pieces. And I think there's a lot more that can be done in if it was much easier to implement, a lot more BI tools in driving some of the processes inside companies that would take on. So I'm hopeful with a number of companies that are working on more of the decentralized way of allowing companies to do AI models and data and analytics, that it actually will start to come. Look, within Cisco, there was a massive AI team that we leveraged, but I had hundreds of SKUs, 6 different businesses, all pretty different islands. And we were not really leveraging, other than insight of a salesperson that has a ton of SKUs, and this is an account, especially in a matrix organization where the seller is selling not only just collaboration products, but servers and this and that and everything else, and the, you know, kitchen sink. How are we not leveraging the user behavior and the behavior of the products, propensity to buy, where we do it all the time on Amazon? Amazon's doing it to us, and we're one individual. We don't do it on really massive organizations as much. And so the way I got around to it is hired, you know, 4 data analytics folks along with leveraging parts of the ML AI team within Cisco, but it really had to have that pairing to make it go, versus in other scenarios, you could just hire and have it go. So it's how do you make that pairing more efficient is, I think, what's going to make some of more of the BI decisions that are happening. And then the other thing is, unfortunately, CIO organizations in most companies are becoming really, there was a wave where, look, CIOs used to be more infrastructure people because it wasn't as much cloud. Then the cloud wave came, and now CIOs have this complex web of stuff that they're managing. So it's becoming, CIO organizations are less being strategic, I would say, and just trying to handle like the complexity of the CIA. And that's, I hear that from a ton of CIOs, and so keeping data integrity. So they're not really on the frontier of thinking about how can we elevate us much more, because it's just trying to digest the stuff they already have. And for better or for worse, for BI tools, it really, a lot of it has relied in the CIO orgs. So until I think the business units start having more ability to do, it won't take off as fast. But I'm seeing that happening now with, like I said, some of the tools that are coming that are really helping with the decentralized nature.
Yeah. Thank you.
Yeah.
Thank you so much for joining us to ask that question live. We now have a few minutes to answer questions for other folks in the audience. So if you do have a question, please just go ahead and use the Q&A logo at the bottom, or feel free to chat it to me, and I'll keep an eye on the chat window too, and relay your questions to Pegah. So we've got the first one in from Jim Spielman. What platforms would you suggest a fintech startup, I would imagine, utilize to optimize both analytics and security? What in terms, or maybe it's an established one, but in terms of cloud storage and security, are there any particular sort of best practices or platforms you want to shut up?
Yeah. So it depends how much data you have. Look, on the security side, I think I'm a huge fan of Sneak. For you don't need top down, and developers love it, and you're keeping up to date. And I will say I'm an advisor to Sneak, but I became, because I'm obsessed with their products, so I had to get involved and figure out how I can be helpful on the and then I would say on AI. If this is for a young company or this is for more established, because I have a lot of ideas for more established fintech companies, but on the
I'm gonna guess established, actually, because they're looking for optimized, optimization and security.
Yeah, so I would say for fintech, yeah. So
the questioner has clarified he means emerging, but institutional capital formation.
Okay, so for emerging, I need to figure out, it depends on if you're trying to push products, if you're trying to incorporate it in your product or you're using it for your own. So if you're actually going to be consumer facing, I think the thing that matters a lot is the speed. So one of the benefits of, having, as a user is interacting with you using that data versus using it in aggregate to come up with some. So I think it matters on what type of fintech you are. If you're a fintech that really needs speed on someone's on your platform and you want to predict pieces and do things like that, this is an early stage company, but I really like what Bodo is doing, but I'm an investor there, so I love what they're doing. And then I would say, like I've mentioned on DataRobot, I think if you're trying to get up to speed, they can create such leverage for your team in not having to worry about the parts that are the nuts and bolts, and it elevates your team. So if you can't get a tier 1 ML AI person, you can turn a tier 2 into a tier 1 by giving them, it's almost like using AI for AI. It's like it's elevating them because certain things are being just done for you. And then obviously on the ML ops pieces, you don't want to be hiring people to just focus on that, where you can actually be think about what the drivers we want to do. So I am a big fan of that in that space, companies that are doing
So you're a believer in managed services also?
Managed services comes with a different perspective for me because of financial. So I do think having the toolkits to elevate people a level with technology, less with the services component, I would say.
Perfect answer.
Yeah.
Jim, if you wanted to sort of explore any follow-ups with Pegah, go ahead and email us at Zetta, and we will get the question to Pegah. Look, let me hit a few other questions here that are kind of interesting. So from Daniel Wang, we have the question: how do you think about model risk when you're implementing ML algorithms? And given the lack of explainability for ML models, do you have any recommendations for how to help people without a technical background to understand?
Yeah, and so back to what I said, I think that's why I think it's in large enterprises. And this is more for the founders in the community that are selling. For larger enterprises, I think you're going to have an easier time selling. You're going to be selling to actually non-AI ML people. So tying it to the business part will be more critical. And to your exact question, one of the things I am seeing is the business unit, even though they're running models and they're saying, okay, here's the R squared, this is really, you don't really know what levers you have, because let's say you're an insurance company and your model is saying, these are potential things to go look out because they could be fraud. Right. As a business unit, I might say, I don't care if the model's a little bit less accurate, but it makes me, not reach out to as many false negatives, and I might be doing that trade-off. But as a business owner, you actually can't make those trade-offs in models. So I think that's an actually interesting piece where having almost a tie-in with the efficacy of the models to what really the business cares about, and what are the levers. Like if you could do if statements and say, if I could move, I only really want to care if the price point of, I only need the model to be really accurate when it's a case that really is going to impact us this much. Like those pieces are actually hard for business users to do. So everything kind of gets gulfed together because the data scientists are the ones that are running the algorithm, and they're trying to optimize for like the highest R squared and all that stuff. But it might actually be, you want to differentiate it and bucket it differently, but it's really hard to do that. So I actually think there's a bunch of opportunity in software around.
You've touched on something which is a soapbox for me, which is, I think that a lot of times one of the maybe dirty or secrets of enterprise AI is that sometimes the thing that works best is an ensemble of a machine learning model and some rules. And there is something to be said for just encoding human know-how in some rules that create sort of guardrails for the model. And, I think as data scientists and machine learning engineers, especially as founders, we want to be purist about the AI solving all parts of it, but sometimes introducing a little bit of impurity is the pragmatic thing that creates value for our customer. Yeah,
100%. And I think a lot of times if the people who have the purse on the decision, because they don't understand the really purity of the stuff, they actually aren't as tied into what is driving and the levers they have. So they kind of feel like they don't have as many levers. And I think the rules part gives them some of those pieces. So I 100% concur with that.
I think this next question also from Nick, and so maybe it ties a little bit about sort of enterprise confidence in data sharing, perhaps. But the question actually is, are you opinionated about? Do you believe synthetic data will be a big enabler of AI use cases for enterprises?
I think it can be. Do I think that's the way they're going to go off the bat? I don't think that's their natural motion as much, but I do think it definitely can be. I just see it. I do think there's going to be some resistance to that. I do think the other thing I would say is, this is totally not answering anyone's questions, but I was just thinking about is that, look, one of the things with AI companies is also that the enterprises, as they're looking for solutions, are also going to want a little bit more of give me some insights to what else is happening. So back to the data question that you asked about, people don't want to share too much of their own data. But one thing they're willing to do is share it if their knowledge base gets better. And we see that actually, this was a huge lesson for me in financials as CIO, is fraud detection is a result of actually mass collaboration also with financial institutions with others. And you see it, you've seen it in that sector, but I actually think now you're seeing it with sales. You know what? Make my sales team more efficient. I don't care if you're using my data to drive insights for other people. If the common insight as a result of everyone's data is going to make my team and I'm being faster in adopting your technology, then it's much more about that versus wanting to hold stuff, because then you're not going to be actually getting the latest insights, what everyone else is taking advantage of. So I think those are spaces where there could be a lot more of.
This is actually a question that someone had written in advance, and I hear it from founders a lot, which is just sort of, oh, how do I sell to, how do I sell my AI-powered solution to big enterprises when big enterprises don't want to share their data with me? And I got to say that when I hear that question, 90% of the time, I think, when a product is valuable enough, when a model's prediction is valuable enough, enterprises do share their data. And so if someone's asking this question, it may not be that it's about, it's not about, the boxes you tick in the security compliance questionnaire. It's about having a more valuable offering for them.
Yeah, it's exactly. It's not, you're not solving this pain point where they feel like they have a total black box in. And look, I think the other thing everyone forgets is, I think this is the psychology thing, is that companies, as complex as they are, as large as they are, as great tech as they have, everyone has pieces that they're not proud of inside the company or they think could be better. And so I do think, especially now more than ever, if you're a product person or you're a CIO or any of these, you're constantly worried about what am I not missing, because the velocity of technology and people taking advantage and leapfrogging people is so much. So I think definitely people are willing to share data if it makes them have better insight on what's happening. They're always wondering, one of the best selling, whether you're AI or not, the best selling you can do, especially if you're a category creator or in a niche, is really focusing on being the expert in that space because of the access you have to all the other, whether it's their competitor, whether it's their non-competitor, but they're similar. And it's using that to drive more sales, is I actually think, because there's a lot more people making decision out of fear as well in software buying.
Going back to your point about sales being half psychology.
Yeah.
So, yeah. I think that's terrific. I've got one more here I really want to ask you from Humphrey Chen, which may or may not prove to be AI relevant, but just thinking about the leadership role you played with Cisco Collaborative. Here we are in not quite post-COVID world yet, but sort of, I think we're transitioning from a completely shelter-in-place world now to a partial, some kind of hybrid world, I guess is the word that's getting kicked around. So what are the collaborative needs or opportunities? What problems should be solved as we think about, this next year and sort of kind of the hybrid back to work?
Yeah, look, I was lucky enough because Cisco, we ate our own dog food. So in a lot of ways, we were a hybrid back then, because we had different people, and a lot of my direct report were not even in the same office, though I did enjoy the face-to-face and all those pieces, and you had moments of that. I think technology-wise, what's going to be the hard part is, in some ways, there's a democratization of connection when everyone was virtual. And what's going to happen as you go back to hybrid, there's going to be, different relationships for it. So you're not really on even footing. So I actually question, for the first year, it's going to be fine, but do the people that work with the, headquarter get promoted more? Do they just have more, really? Do they have more FaceTime? Do they just have more chemistry? Because and there's certain parts of being a hybrid that are extremely beneficial as an operational executor, because it's really efficient. I went on my first business trip to New York, and I was like zooming around the city from meeting to meeting, and then I would get home and I was like, oh my God, I haven't done any of my work. Whereas at least when you're just, I feel like much more of, you don't have to have as many of the smaller stuff, and you can use some of your bite-sized time more, whereas when you're face-to-face, your bite-sized time is used more for relationship building, which is also good. So I think technology-wise, what is really valuable to solve in the hybrid is how do you make the people who are not there in person not feel as left out? Because you can imagine you're in a conference room, 3 people are together, they're talking right before the meeting, they're talking right after the meeting, and how do you make that more natural and more of making opportunities for people to feel like more involved in those things as well. And I do think, look, organizationally, this is not technology, but organizationally, I think there's going to be much more need for bonding period, because one of the things we all learned is when you're on, collaboration software, you just get down to business very quickly, right? Yeah. So which is great for getting business done, but not necessarily great for long-term relationship building. And also for employees, there's not as much of a loyalty factor as a result of it either. I can just imagine number of jobs I've had in the past where if they were all virtual, I probably would have quit way earlier than I had. I mean, that's real, right?
No, it's like a huge part of what keeps us at companies is our bonds to our coworkers, that social cohesion. So if that dries up, I do think it changes people's relationship to their employers too. So I think
I would say the part and I would say technology wise, the part I always get fascinated by is in gaming. I'm not a gamer, but I went to a school where everyone was doing all these games outside of their dorm room, and I've been surrounded by gamers.
Your game is poker. We got it.
But I would say, like, they have actually done it well, right? Like, there's people who never meet each other and feel so connected. So I think there's some aspects of gaming that have to be introduced more into enterprise collaboration if you really want some more of those connection pieces, and you can't just be all or so anyway. There's more.
Yes, there's a whole other episode of Zettabytes Live we can do on AR VR.
Exactly.
Well, we just have a minute or two left, but I want to see if you have any sort of quick hits on one last question, because it is, I think, a question that's fascinating to me personally, which is about emerging tech ecosystems and the kind of how can some of those emerge, especially with a focus on, can they use AI as a springboard in terms of next generation of AI talent. And I'll be on the record saying I think I think it's wonderful that Silicon Valley is exporting its playbooks, not just its companies, and that we're seeing more and more tech ecosystems globally. And I think AI is a big part of that, because there's definitely places academically, research oriented that are way ahead in AI, and sort of how can that be leveraged to build a tech ecosystem around it? Any quick thoughts on that? I know I'm not giving you long enough to answer it in full.
I would say I think universities are driving it a lot. Investments out of universities, there's different great hubs in Switzerland and Eastern Europe and other places. And I think because in a lot of ways, so many folks that came from the AI, it's much more academic. Look, computer science, you could say, is academic, but it's much less academic. It's very more purpose-driven, whereas it's much the new emerging pieces coming out of AI, and actually even just new things that are happening in universities, are going to be the foundation for having models that are built much faster with less data. Maybe, and so I think
active learning, transfer learning, et cetera.
Exactly. So I think really having, it's going to be around those academic hubs, just because there's always this ability for people to group together, and it's happened in investing. I mean, that's why it's easier to invest out in Silicon Valley. There's just more VCs, more all that stuff, more shared knowledge, and I think that's happening with some of the university programs. So as a countries, I think investing in those spaces in academic years is actually going to drive a lot more of the entrepreneurship and emerging technologies down the line in 5-10.
Fantastic, Pegah. Thank you so very much for joining us today. We were honored to have you. I think if members of the audience, I'm sure, are hungry for more. If you have questions or follow-ups for Pegah,
if you guys are
please email me.
Yes. If you're selling to enterprise, don't hesitate. I'm anything for VC partners I love. So
yes. So if you reach out to us, we can get you in touch with Pegah, and we'll forward you on her way. And so thanks so much, and for all of our audience members for joining us, and have a wonderful day. Thanks
Keep
again,
doing
Pegah.
amazing things, guys. Bye.